Chapter 4. What John Rance had to tell. It was 1 o'clock when we left number 3 Lauriston Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led me to the nearest telegraph office, whence he dispatched a long telegram. He then hailed a cab and ordered the driver to take us to the address given to us by Lestrade. There is nothing like first-hand evidence, he remarked. As a matter of fact, my mind is entirely made up on the case, but we still may have to learn from what is to be learned. You amaze me, Holmes, said I. Surely you are not sure that you pretend to be all those particulars which you gave. There's no room for mistake, he answered. The very first thing I did, which was observed on arriving them, was that the cab was made 2 ruts with its wheels close to the curb. Now, up to last night, we have had no rain for a week, so that those wheels which had left deep impression must have been there during the night. There were the marks of the horse's hoofs, too, the outline of one which was far more clearly cut than those of the other 3, showing that it must be a new shoe. Since the cab was there after the rain began, and was not there at any time during the morning, I have Gregson's word for it. It allows that it must have been there during the night, and therefore that it brought those 2 individuals to the house. That seems simple enough, said I, but how about the other man's height? Why, the height of the man, in 9 cases out of 10, can be told the length of the stride. It is a simple calculation enough, though there is no use in my boring you with figures. I had this fellow's stride both on the clay outside and on the dust within. But then I had a way of checking my calculation. When the man writes on the wall, his instinct leads him to write about the level of his own eyes. Now that the writing was just over 6 feet from the ground, it was child's play. And his age, I asked? Well, if a man can stride 4.5 feet without the smallest effort, he can't be quite in the sere and yellow. That was the breadth of the puddle of the garden walk which he had evidently walked across. Patent leather boots had gone round, and square toes had hopped over. There is no mystery about it all. I am simply applying the extraordinary life of those few perceptions of observation and deduction which I have advocated in that article. Is there anything else that puzzles you? The fingernails in the trichipoli, I suggested. The writing on the wall was done with a man's forefinger dipped in blood. My glass allowed me to observe that the plaster was slightly scratched in doing so, which would not have been the case if the man's fingernails had been trimmed. I gathered up some of the scattered ash from the floor. It was a dark and color flaky, such as the ash is only made up by trichipoli. I have made a special study of cigar ashes. In fact, I have written a monograph upon the subject. I flatter myself that I can distinguish at a glance the ash of any known brand of cigar or tobacco. It is just in such details that the skilled detective differs from Gregson and the lesson type. And the florid face. Ah, that was a more daring dart, though I have no doubt that I was right. You must not ask me at the present state of the affair. I passed my hand over my brow. My head is in a whirl, I remarked. The more one thinks about it, the more mysterious it grows. How came those 2 men, if there were 2 men, in an empty house? What has become of the cabman who drove them? How could one man compel another to take poison? Where did the blood come from? What was the object of the murderer, since robbery had no part of it? How came the woman's wedding there? Above all, why should the second man give up the German word rash before decamping? I confess I cannot see any possible way of reconciling all these facts. My companion smiled approvingly. You sum up the difficulties of the situation succinctly and well, he said. There is much that can be obscure, though I have made up my mind on the main facts. As to poor Lestrade's discovery, it was simply a blind intended to put your police upon the wrong track, by suggesting socialism and secret societies. It was not done by a German. The A, if you notice, was printed somewhat after the German fashion. Now, real German invariably prints in the Latin character, so that we may safely say that this was not written by one, but by a clumsy imitator who overdid the part. It was simply a ruse to divert inquiries into a wrong channel. I'm not going to tell you much more on the case, Doctor. You know a conjurer gets no credit once he has explained his trick. And if I show you too much of my method of working, you will come to the conclusion that I am a very ordinary individual after all. I shall never do that, I answered. You have brought deduction to as near as exact science as it will ever be brought in this world. My companion flushed upon the measure of my words, and an earnest way in which I uttered them. I had already observed that he was very sensitive to flattery on the score of my art, as any girl could be on her beauty. I'll tell you one other thing, he said. The patent leathers and the square toes came in the same cab, and they walked down the pathway together as friendly as possible, arm in arm in all probability. When they got inside, they walked up and down the room, or rather, patent leathers stood while the square toes walked up and down. I could read all that in the dust, and I could read that they walked. He grew more and more excited. That is shown in the increased length of the strides. He was talking all the while, and working himself up, no doubt, into a fury. Then the tragedy occurred. I've told you all that I know myself now, and for the rest is mere surmise and conjecture. We have a good working basis, however, on which to start. We must hurry up, for I want to go to Haley's concert to hear Norman Neruda this afternoon. The conversation had occurred that her cab had been threading its way through long successions of dingy streets and dreary byways. And the dingiest and dreariest of them, our driver suddenly came to a stand. That's Audley Court in there, he said, pointing to the narrow slit in the line of dead-colored brick. You'll find me here when you get back. Audley Court was not an attractive locality. The narrow passage led us into a quadrangle paved with flags and lined by sordid dwellings. We picked our way among the groups of dirty children and through the lines of discolored linen until we came to number 46, the door of which was decorated with a small slip of brass on which the name Rance was engraved. On inquiry, we found the constable was in bed, and we were shown into a little front parlor to wait his coming. He appeared presently, looking a little irritable but being disturbed in his slumbers. I made my report at the office, he said. Holmes took a half-sovereign from his pocket and played with it pensively. We thought that we might like to hear it from your own lips, he said. I shall be most happy to tell you anything I can, the constable answered, with his eyes upon the little golden disc. And just let us hear it in your own words, the way it occurred. Rance sat down on his horsehair sofa and knitted his brows, as though determined not to omit anything from his narrative. I'll tell you from the beginning, he said. My time is from 10 at night to 6 in the morning. At 11 there was a fight at the White Hart, but the bar that was all quiet enough on the beat. At 1 o'clock it began to rain, and I met Harry Muncher. He was at Hollywood Grove beat, and he stood at the corner of Henrietta Street a-talking. Presently, about 2 or a little after, I thought I would take a look round to see if it was all right in the Brixton Road. It was precious dirty and lonely. Not a soul did I meet all the way down, though a cab or two went past me. I was just strolling down, thinking between ourselves how uncommonly handy a full of gin hot would be, when suddenly a glint of light caught my sight in the window of the same house. Now, I knew that them two houses in Larriston Gardens was empty on the account of that him that owns them who won't have the drain seeds to, though the very last tenant what lived in one of them died of the typhoid fever. I knocked down all the heap, therefore, and seen a light in the window, and I suspected that something was wrong. When I got to the door, you stopped, and then you walked back to the garden gate. My companion interrupted. What did you do that for? Rance gave a violent jump and stared at Sherlock Holmes with the most utmost amazement upon his features. Why, that's true, sir, he said, though how you come to it, heaven only knows. You see, when I got up to the door, it was all still lonesome, that I thought I'd been none the worse for someone to give with me. I ain't afraid of anything on this side of the grave, but I thought that might be him that died of the typhoid inspecting the drains what killed him. The thought gave me some kind of turn, and I walked back to the gate to see if I could see Murch's lantern. But there wasn't no sign of him, nor anyone else. There was no one on the street. Not a living soul, sir, not as much as a dog. And then I pulled myself together and went back and pushed the door open. All was quiet inside, so I went in the room, and the lighting was burning. There was a candle flickering on the mantelpiece, red wax one, and by its light I saw... Yes, I know what you saw. You walked around the room several times, you knelt down by the body, and then you walked through and tried to kick the door. And then... John Rance sprang to his feet, a frightened face, suspicion in his eyes. Where was you hid to see all that? He cried. It seems to me that you knows a deal more than you should. Holmes laughed and threw his card across the table to the constable. Don't get arresting me for murder, he said. I was one of the hounds, not the wolf. Mr. Gregson and Mr. Lestrade will answer for that. Go on, though. What did you do next? Rance resumed his seat, without, however, losing his mystified expression. I went back to the gate and sounded my whistle. That brought Monsieur and two others to the spot. Was the street empty then? Well, it was, as far as anybody that could be of any good was. What do you mean? The constable's features broadened into grin. I've seen many a drunk chap in my time, he said, but never anyone so crying drunk over that cove. He was at the gate when I came out, leaning up against the railings and singing at the pitch of his lungs about Columbine's newfangled banner, or some such stuff. He couldn't stand up, far less help. What sort of a man was he? Asked Sherlock Holmes. John Rance appeared to be somewhat irritated at this digression. It was a common drunk sort of man, he said. He'd have found himself in the station if we hadn't been so took up. His face, his dress. Didn't you notice them? Holmes broke in impatiently. I should think I did notice him, seeing that I had to prop him up. Me and Murcher between us. He was a long chap with a red face and the lower part muffled round. That will do. What became of him? We'd enough to do without looking after him, the policeman said with an aggravated voice. I'll wager he found his way home all right. How was he dressed? Brown overcoat? Had he a whip in his hand? A whip? No. He must have left it behind, muttered my companion. You didn't happen to see or hear a cab after that? No. There's a half-sovereign for you, my companion said, standing up and taking his hat. I'm afraid, Rance, that you will never rise in the force. That head of yours should be used as an ornament. You might have gained your sergeant's stripes last night. The man whom you held in your hands is the man who holds the clue to this mystery, and whom we are seeking. There is no use of arguing about it now. I'll tell you that it is so. Come along, Doctor. We started off with a cab together, leaving our informant incredulous, but obviously uncomfortable. That blundering fool, Holmes said bitterly as we drove back to our lodgings. Just to think of his having had such an incomparable bit of luck, and not taking advantage of it. I'm still rather in the dark about this. Is it true that the description of the man tallies with your idea of the second party in this mystery? But why should he come back to the house after leaving it? That is not the way of criminals. The ring, man, the ring. That is what he came back for. If you have no other way of catching him, we can always bait our line up with a ring. I shall have him, Doctor. I'll lay you 2-1 that I will have him. I must thank you for it all. I might not have gone but for you, and have missed so fine a study I ever came across. A study in Scarlet, eh? Well, why shouldn't we use a little art jargon? There's a scarlet thread of murder running through our colourless skein of life. Our duty is to unravel it, and isolate it, to expose every inch of it. And now for lunch. And then to Norma Miranda. Her attack and her bowing are splendid. What's that little thing of Chopin's? She plays so magnificently. Tra-la-la, leery-leery-lay. Leaning back in the cab, this amateur bloodhound controlled away like a lark, while I meditated upon the many-sidedness of human nature.